I have something wonderful for you guys today. The score you see on the screen right now is an edition of Czerny's School of Velocity, the famous Opus 299, edited and published in 1875 by Charles Kunkel. Your tempo-trained eyes doubtlessly have scanned already the double metronome marks that got me so excited and for sure makes you curious to a degree. I can imagine you want to close this video to look into this score right away yourself. Wait a little bit with that, since not only would it send out the wrong signal to YouTube's algorithm, but more important, you want to stick around since we're gonna break this score down and give you a little bit of background on who this Mr. Charles Kunkel was and what these mysterious metronome numbers tell us. There is very little information available on the Kunkel brothers, because yes, there were two of them, Charles and Jacob, both concert pianists originating from Germany and one of the most successful publishers and 19th early 20th century as well. On IMSLP you'll find a short bio. I quote, "The music publishing firm Kunkel Brothers was established by the German-born brothers Charles Kunkel and Jacob Kunkel in St. Louis, Missouri in 1868. The brothers were concert pianists, both having studied with Louis Moreau Gottschalk and Charles having also studied with Sigismund Thalberg. The firm published many of the brothers' own compositions under their own names and under various pseudonyms. After Jacob's death in 1882, Charles became the sole operator of the firm, which apparently did not survive his own death in 1923. In September 1878, Kunkel Brothers began publishing their monthly magazine Kunkel's Musical Review. Each volume contained a significant amount of music, over 50 pages by 1899, in full sheet music size. Publication of the journal ceased with volume 32 in October 1999. End of quote. You can spend hours downloading hundreds of their publications from the website archive.org, which I recommend all of you to bookmark. IMSLP gives some of the compositions by Charles Kunkel, but as far as I know, not too many of their publications of other composers. They must have been outstanding businessmen. The scores were mainly sold through subscriptions, as they sold pianos of all brands, as well as their own line of instruments through their stores. Here's information from the website antiquepianoshop.com. Kunkel Brothers was a large, successful retailer of musical instruments and related merchandise in St. Louis, Missouri during the late 19th and early 20th century era. Kunkel Brothers started out selling sheet music and various musical instruments after the Civil War, and by the turn of the century era they were marketing their own line of pianos and player pianos. They sold their instruments both through their large stores and mail-order catalogs, distributing their instruments all across the Midwestern United States. Kunkel Brothers was out of business by the Great Depression. So it is clear that the Kunkel brothers were far from amateurs on every aspect of their branch. Both studied piano with the famous pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk, of which we had recently 2 pieces in WBMP as community contributions here on the channel. But Charles, who outlived his brother many years, apparently also the stronghold of the company, also studied with the famous Sigismund Thalberg, one of Europe's absolute top pianists at the time, the legendary pianist of which they said he must have had 3 hands. So all to say that the Kunkel brothers were on top of their game. And now back to our magnificent score. As you will see, we're looking at the second book of Czerny's Opus 299. And as an exception, the first book was not edited by one of the Kunkel brothers, but by Franz Bausimer. Of this Mr. Bausimer, nothing more is known to me but the fact that around 1860 he taught piano in Berlin, Germany. And that first book is harder to find than part 2 of the series, but basically the principle is the same. Czerny's authentic metronome mark is given, the editor provides his own tempi for the slowest to the fastest he holds right for the piece, between brackets. We focus here in this video on the edition Charles Kunkel himself has made for part 2. can make a separate video if you want for part 1 of this book, but again, the principles are exactly the same. So to start, let me give you an overview of the 12 etudes presented in this volume. And by the way, Kunkel changed the order of the etudes, and the selection of both volumes together are not giving the entire Opus 299. So for number 1, Czerny gives half note 96, Kunkel gives for the slowest 96 for the quarter note and quarter note 120 for the fastest. Number 2, Czerny half note 96, Kunkel quarter note 96 to quarter note 132. For number 3, Czerny gives dotted half note 63, Kunkel as the slowest tempo gives dotted quarter note 80, fastest dotted quarter note 104. Number 4, Czerny gives dotted quarter note 72, Kunkel gives 8 note 104 till 8 note 132. For number 5, Czerny half note 92, Kunkel quarter note 80 to 120. Number 6, Czerny half note 100, Kunkel gives 100 for the quarter note up to 132 for the quarter note. Number 7, Czerny gives half note 76, Kunkel gives quarter note 72 up to quarter note 92. For number 8, Czerny gives 104 for the quarter note, Kunkel gives quarter note 66 up to quarter note 88. For number 9, Czerny gives quarter note 88, Kunkel gives 8 note 104 up to 8 note 132. Number 10, Czerny gives half note 84, Kunkel gives quarter note 104 up to quarter note 132. Number 11, Czerny gives quarter note 108, Kunkel gives as the slowest tempo 8 note 120 up to 8 note 152. And the last one, number 12, Czerny gives half note 92, Kunkel gives quarter note 120 to quarter note 152. So, and contrary to what still many teachers will tell you, the metronome marks Czerny gave for his etudes are exact and actual tempi he wants you and me, and your teachers, let's not forget that, to perform. They are no targets. In case you're not convinced by what I tell you right now, allow me to run a short passage of a recent video in which I shared Czerny's own words with you. So for instance, he wrote this in the preface of his famous Opus 299, the Schule der Geläufigkeit or School of Velocity, and I quote, "The following pieces are especially tended to unfold this branch of performance, to augment and to preserve it. The only condition is that after you have well exercised them, you play them every day prior to others in the marked tempo." Something similar we read in his daily exercises, Opus 337, which is, as we've seen, the Opus 299 on steroids, and I quote, "On exercera chaque numéro avec toutes les répétitions indiquées sans interruption et dans le mouvement du métronome, on se reposera seulement après chaque coda." Or in English, one studies every exercise with all repeats indicated without interruption and in the tempo of the metronome, while resting only after each coda. One of the most important things to notice here is that Charles Kunkel did not always follow or half Czerny's original metronome marks. In the table of his slowest tempi, 9 out of 12 tempi have a different number than that of Czerny. It's important to realize that, since it shows that Kunkel gave his own tempi for these etudes regardless of Czerny's. If this were not the case, he at the minimum would have kept Czerny's number in his slowest version, but he didn't. And now that we have that information, the fun can start by comparing. When we take the perspective of the majority of musicians, conservatories, in short, the musical establishment of today, namely that Czerny's metronome marks should be read exactly as we do today, Kunkel's slowest tempi are off by an average of 45%. In other words, if Czerny really was a half-beat composer, so when the metronome ticks indeed would indicate the entire note value of the metronome mark instead of the subdivision, then Kunkel's slowest tempi would turn out to be almost exactly half of Czerny's. This fact alone should set off some alarms. When we add to this column, still from the perspective of Czerny as a half-beater, Kunkel's fastest tempi, we still have a large gap of about 30% on average to close with Czerny's original tempi. The possible remark that Charles Kunkel prepared this edition only for students And that was the reason to slow down the Czerny tempi so drastically doesn't make sense, since also Czerny focused with the Opus 299 on students. He for sure did not want Franz Liszt to play these anymore when published somewhere in the 1830s. And claiming, as my half-beat friends like to do so often, that etudes in these tempi become laughably easy is a proof only of never have tried them, since they are not easy to play. Talking on the Opus 299, people tend to focus on the first opening etudes only, but the majority of these etudes, however, even played in WBMP, is of a difficulty that only would fit today to students at the end of their music school training. So our 16 to 18-year-olds, a part of the etudes I'd say would even have to be preserved for the conservatory student and not the average one. Moreover, we see Kunkel giving lots of so-called osias, alternatives to make the music quite a bit more difficult than Czerny originally had in mind. And I invite you all to play these osias in the slowest or fastest tempi indicated by Kunkel. It's far from considered for beginners. Okay, let's now see what happens if we consider Czerny to be a whole beat composer and we keep reading Kunkel's numbers in half beat. You know, the WBMP, the whole beat metronome practice where the metronome ticks indicate the subdivision of the note value of the metronome mark, similar to how we all learn to beat notes in music school, namely 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. No surprise that suddenly Kunkel's personal tempi fall almost exactly in line with Czerny's. On average, he is 10% faster than Czerny. And the fastest version of his tempi are on average 43% faster than Czerny originally had in mind. That ties in very well into the well-documented evolution in the 19th century where tempi went up along with all other aspects of life influenced heavily by the idea of the industrialization. 10 to 43% perfectly fits into that image. So indeed, important to note as well is the fact that Kunkel gave his metronome marks in half or single beat. That is something that as early as 1875 is quite advanced. There are some other examples of half beat that early, as for instance the famous etudes by Hanon, bundled in Le Pianiste Virtuose, a book we'll compare soon to Czerny as well. But the remarkable thing here is that both whole beat and single beat metronome marks are put together as if it is the most logical thing on earth to do. It reminds me again to the Reger-Straube story, for which we interviewed some years ago Henrico Stuen, author of the Straube Code. Link to that interview in the info card over here. If you would expect to find one single word in the entire 2 books written about this different notation method, I have to disappoint you, because there is not. Even not in the preface of volume 1, sent to me by one of my patrons, not in the footnotes, even not in the testimonials you'll find in volume 1. And to make the story a bit more intriguing, paging through the hundreds of other Kunkel editions, many of which provide metronome marks for works by Liszt and other that nowhere else have been metronomized, one finds whole beat and half beat metronome numbers living peacefully alongside each other. Never in one publication, but from one piece to another. I have not paged through all of their editions, that's something that needs to be done, and only after which work we could tell something with certainty, but it seems to me that the majority of the given MMs are still in whole beat, certainly for those pieces of European composers. Now, regarding these Kunkel brothers, a lot still can be done. If you imagine only their musical magazine, which appeared in a 50-page volume each month for almost 32 years, you know there is work to do, and perhaps one will find not a single word on the methodology of the metronome numbers in these almost 20,000 pages. So, questions remain as to why it was so natural for that generation of musicians and music lovers to see both whole beat and half beat numbers alongside each other. I'll bring a similar stunning story on Raúl Puño, second generation Chopin student, soon. Perhaps the solution is as simple as someone recently wrote to me. His piano teacher back in the days said that if the metronome mark felt as too fast, one simply had to take 2 ticks for 1. I sadly have not copied that comment, so if you're the one who shared this with me, please leave the story again in the comments below, because it's important. Many things we don't know yet. But what I do know is that once one accepts the WBMP as an historic fact, and only then suddenly one starts to see all kinds of new connections and explanations. As one stumbles upon a score of the to me totally unknown Kunkel Brothers as this Czerny edition. And what I do know is a fact that without accepting the WBMP as an historic fact, there is no logical explanation to these metronome marks. And so yes, Charles Kunkel might be a better lead for us to those lost, authentic voices of the past than pianists as Pollini are. You'll not hear me apologize for the title I used for this video, since it doesn't say the Pollinis of this world are not worth listening to. But perhaps they do not lead us to that lost world of a musical paradise that we, at least I know that's the case for you watching this channel, so much want to enter again. And the good news is, it's possible. You just have to be open for it. If this story made you curious to the Kunkel Brothers, you'll find some links in the description box. And if you like to get more stories like this one, do subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget to hit the bell as well, so YouTube can notify you for future updates. And become part of this musical movement by becoming an Authentic Sound Insider at patreon.com. You'll find a strong community there, my personal practicing sessions, previews of the YouTube videos and insight updates as well. Link below and in the description box. Thanks for watching and see you soon again.